Book questions, let's answer some. The first question I got was actually not the first question I got. Instagram just decided to put it in a different order. Is I know nothing about finance, where should I start? And the person who asked this is like QXOZP, something like this. Q-tip. The book I would recommend is this book. This is a great book about why finance is important. It's basically like a history of finance / money. Mostly finance though. It talks about the important functions that finance actually serves. Like for example, if an investor has extra money that they're willing to risk, they can take on risk from a company and make the company more stable because the investor took on the risk as opposed to the company. Yada yada yada. I'd read this just to get the ideas behind finance. Then if you want to really get into the actual nitty gritty, an introduction to finance, maybe some business mathematics books, and then go from there. At that point you already know where to go. Nabokov's Butterfly asked me, I've never read anything before, what's a good book to pique my interest? I'm going to say The Critique of Pure Reason. This is a highly regarded book. It is great for people who have never read books before. In all seriousness, maybe just read something by like Walden or Emerson or Michel de Montaigne. Just read some essayists, get a feel for reading. And essayists tend to be really whimsical, so you don't have to get into anything too niche. It's a good start if you actually haven't started reading anything before. Vinci Wan asked me what's my take on Adam Grant. I haven't read Adam Grant. I've just seen videos of Adam Grant. I have really no opinions on him so far. Jev asks me, best book in 2022? That is a super difficult question. I haven't actually thought about this. I'm gonna just off the top of my memory say it's gonna either be between Adrian Goldsworthy's Caesar biography or Thomas Feldman's from Beirut to Jerusalem. Those two books were super good. I don't know if they're the best books of 2022. We'll see. Supinderman wants to know about my opinion on this idea that bilingual people have higher IQs than monolingual people. That's a whole like bag of confounding variables to open, because I'd imagine people who are bilingual are also more eager to learn and so on and so forth. It's not the fact that they're bilingual that they're smarter. On top of that, I don't know, I think IQ is mostly a meme at this point. Like it measures learning disabilities really well. But Nassim Taleb has a really good argument about applying noise filters to IQ data. And when you just apply the bottom 10% as noise, meaningful correlations almost disappear completely when it comes to IQ. So like IQ in wealth, IQ in educational performance, so on and so forth. I haven't read a ton of stuff on IQ. I've watched like lectures, maybe 1 or 2 books, but like not nearly enough to have super firm opinions on IQ. Mard917 wants to know my 3 favorite philosophy books, or name 3 favorite philosophy books. 1, I'd have to say, is going to be The Social Construction of Reality by John Searle. 2, The Concept of Law by H.L.A. Hart. And 3, The Philosophy of Walking. Those are probably my favorite philosophy books of all time. Zubair asks, is Beyond Order by Jordan Peterson overrated? Is it worth reading? What are your thoughts? I put Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order book, I actually just read it maybe last month, at the end of last month. I put it in my video, Overrated Books and Their Underrated Counterparts, Part 3, because I do think it is an overrated book, right? Peterson sells millions of copies of all of his books, and when you actually read the content of these books, it was kind of like a rehash of Jungian psychology. The ideas weren't super novel. Yeah, I mean, there was interesting ideas about humans need to impose order beyond things and how we actually need to learn how to live in chaos. And I think that idea is really cool. But other than that, the book was it doesn't live up to the economic success that it's had. I'll put it like that, right? That's why I think it's overrated. It's not necessarily a bad book, but I would say maybe it's 4 to 3.5 stars out of 5. A dude who reads asks, what is the best book on linguistics that I have read? I would have to say, okay, so Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct was really good. There's a lot of arguments in there that basically say that if you look at how language develops, it's not just an environmental thing, there's way too much evidence for genetic factors, and this can be used to support the existence of human nature. I think that is a really niche argument, and it's also a very fun argument to go through. And so I really like that book. I read that book when I was in college, and it was a good book. However, George Lakoff's philosophy in the flesh, embodied cognition, really kind of takes this approach that I've never seen in language before, where he says that all cognition is just metaphors or schemas, and they're non-literal projections onto the world around us. And he has a lot of really, really good connections between embodied cognition and models of language. So that book is also really, really fun and exciting to read, especially if you're new to this stuff. That book changed my mind a lot on not just human cognition, but the nature of language as well. It's a tie between those two books. On top of that, John Searle has a really good book about, I guess it wouldn't really be linguistics, it would kind of be like philosophy of language, about like language and society and how these two things interact. I would give it a coin toss if we're specifically talking about linguistics, a coin toss between Philosophy in the Flesh and The Language Instinct. Those books are really good. Shuba asks a good question, which is, how do you get interest into like other fields or other genres of books? And I would say the novelty factor is the biggest factor for me. The best example I can think of is, I came from like studying psychology when I went into economics, and so my notions about human nature were much different than how old school neoliberal economics, because when you get intro into economics, they teach you neoliberal economics, right? And the old school neoliberal economic conception of human nature is way different than how psychologists view human nature, right? Where a psychologist might look at human nature as rewards and punishment, right? Conditioning. A neoliberal economist would say that humans have self-interest, and their self-interest is governed by like monetary incentives. So demand, supply, bartering, so on and so forth. These are all driven by self-interest. And that's a really, really different way of viewing the foundations of human nature, as opposed to like rewards and punishment, which then goes to biology. So stuff like that, that novelty of comparing these two things and getting exposed to those new ideas, that's what really drives me to look at different genres. Samuel asks, is literature considered in some sense a psychology? And I would say, yeah, it pretty much is. It's almost like literature is like the theoretical physics of psychology, where you're just kind of coming up with these personalities or these characters that have certain features and then putting them in situations where you think they should behave in a certain pattern. That's kind of how I view literature, and I think that stuff is really interesting actually. One of the reasons why I liked reading the author of Fight Club, I forget his name, Chuck something, I forget his name, but is he writes really interesting characters that he puts in really novel situations, and I like relating that back to how I understand humans now, I understand psychology. So yeah, I would say definitely literature is in some sense a form of like theoretical psychology. RXJ says, he kind of actually makes a statement, doesn't ask a question, but says that he feels anxious because he started reading late at the age of 24, and that gives him a sense of like urgency to read faster. So I think the question really is like, is this a problem? Or like, should you feel anxious about this? And I would say no, because for very complex reasons, I think all writing is just arbitrary explanations, and none of them are more true than the others, right? I always give this example of like the nature of morality, okay? If you have two people who agree that we shouldn't be killing people in society, and one argues that they believe this because they have moral beliefs about the nature of killing, and the other one says it's just their preference not to kill. As long as the behavior of not killing is agreed upon, I actually don't care about the theoretical explanations, right? Which brings the question, why even read anyways? Well, it's fun, it's like entertaining to look at different like mental models of reality, different explanations and theories. It's ultimately going to boil down to just fun, right? So when people say like, oh, I'm going to read as many books as I can, I mean, you're probably not even going to remember more than like 100 books. And on top of that, it's all arbitrary. If you don't get behind that, just don't worry about it. There's times where I don't read at all. Like there's times where I don't read for like a month, maybe 2 months, just doing other things. You don't need to read every book in the world, and you don't need to be the person in the room who's read the most books. RBBT asks, which kind of books do you read for a challenge? And the answer is textbooks, or like books that require you to read slower, like subjects that require you to read slower. A lot of people get too hooked up on this, I need to read 52 books a year, or like I need to read 55 books a year kind of thing. In my mind, if you're reading 60 or 70 books a year, if you're even close to that number, you're reading easy books, right? And I think that's a problem because the books that change my mind the most are the books that make me think of what I'm reading. And when I say change my mind, I mean like come across new ways of thinking. Simply having another person tell me about the benefits of digital marketing or like having leverage, things that you can leverage, it's just a new set of words. It's not really changing my mind. It's just reinforcing things, right? Finance, chemistry, biology, textbooks in these areas, you're going to read them slower. I read history books at maybe 25 pages an hour. I read finance textbooks at maybe 6 to 7 pages an hour. Choose harder subjects, choose textbooks. Definitely choose fat esoteric books that have like 1,000 pages. Those books read really slow. Yeah, just get into more difficult subjects. I would say, in my personal opinion, don't aim to read 50 or 60 books a year. Maybe aim to read 30. Yigit asks, what's a book that makes me more curious or has made me more curious? I would actually say Leonardo da Vinci's biography by Isaacson and also Leonardo da Vinci's Notebooks. Those two books were kind of inspirational for me in the sense that like Da Vinci, having zero expertise on things like the physics of water, would go out and write doctrines, or like you could say maybe aphorisms, essays, on the nature of water. He would just sit there and study it and descriptively write down. So if he threw a stone, what would happen? If he skipped it versus like dropping it in the center. If it was windy out, what was the behavior of the water? That's just simply doing that is a very that was a novel thing to me at the time, because usually the way we learn things in modern society is to pick up a book about it and learn about it. But how many of us go outside and just say, look at trees in the wind and write down the behavior of the trees and try and study the trees for ourselves with no presupposed theoretical frameworks? That is a very interesting idea to me, and maybe you could read those books and do the same. Jen Semener asks me, who is my favorite philosopher and why? That's quite a difficult question, actually, because I like a lot of them, but like maybe John Searle, simply because of the views he has, are really, I think, unique in the context of his peers. A lot of Searle's books are actually very connected, and he has a worldview that he's built up over time about the nature of social construction, so basically how things become norms or institutions in society, the functions of language, and how the functions of language relate back to like social roles and social norms and so on and so forth. And basically all of his books kind of interrelate in that sense, which is not that common amongst modern writers. People tend to call it systems philosophy. So Immanuel Kant had what was called systems philosophy, where like he had a whole entire system and it was interconnected in every facet of philosophy. Oh yeah, let's say maybe John Searle at this point. Johnny Carr asks, have I ever walked away from an unfinished book? Yes. Especially when I was earlier on into my reading journey. There were books that I picked up, I would get halfway through, I'd go, wow, this sounds like very loosey-goosey, very like pseudoscience-y. Not that all pseudoscience is bad. I agree, there are some things that we cannot measure with science, but we must talk about, right? But some of this stuff was just too far out for me, and I would just put it down and walk away. Most of the time it was because I picked up a book that I knew nothing about the field and I was just curious, and then things would go downhill from there. So yeah, I've definitely walked away from unfinished books. Jacob Peck asks me, how do I structure studying subjects? Good question. I actually have a few subjects that I'm going to study now, but yeah, there's a few ways I do it, and over time I do it in different ways. Like I made videos about this. Right now, when I'm studying, like I'm currently studying the nature of power, and the way I went about studying this specific subject was to ask, what is power? And then try and find journal articles or books that will actually answer that question in specific, because there's a lot of unrelated things on that question as well. Or sorry, related to power, but not necessarily answering that question. There's also another approach that I like to do where I'll buy general history books. So let's say I want to study Middle Eastern history. There are a lot of general Middle Eastern history books out there, and maybe I'll read 4 or 5 of them, maybe 6, if I'm feeling extra ready. And I'll get all the different perspectives, maybe develop a timeline or like a narrative based off of the different perspectives given by the different historians. Another thing I might do is buy one book. So like you can go into a specific subject, and let's say you go into epidemiology, okay? Which is what I'm doing currently. And you go, okay, well, I want a book on quarantines. I want a book on microbial resistance. I want a book on, let's say, influenza and how it spreads. You can go into different sub-subjects in epidemiology and just get one introductory book for each of the sub-subjects and go from there. There are a few ways. I can link the video that I made on this subject because there's a lot of ways of going about this. But those are just two of the current ways I'm doing it. Bashar asked me my thoughts on e-readers. If you like them, use them, but I'd rather read from a stone tablet than an e-reader. I'm a purist. I want the actual written documents in my hand. I take Papria over an e-reader. Bookloafer asked me what my opinion on Richard Dawkins is. A bit edgy, like he has like some decent arguments. I like his books. He has interesting ideas. But when it comes to just his, I don't know, like to me, there is no justification that you can give for like any worldview, and so it's all equally arbitrary. So if someone wants to believe one thing over another, and they're not harming people, and they're still productive members of society, go ahead, right? Yeah, I don't know. I think he's a bit too focused on religion sometimes. His stuff in biology is quite interesting. Like I think it's his PhD thesis was on niche construction theory, which was the first time I ever heard about it. And this is super cool, right? Like that the idea that there are some animals that build their environment. I don't know. Was that his PhD thesis? I don't know. A paper he was mentioned in maybe that some animals build their own environments. And adapt to those environments. So like a spider adapts to the spider web that it builds, humans adapt to like the houses that they build, so on and so forth. That's really cool. That was interesting. He has a lot of good ideas, but I think when it comes to secularism and atheism, he's a bit too insistent on something sometimes. But that might just come with the territory of being a public figure. I don't know. He's cool, he's okay on my books. So those were not all the book questions that I got. I got well over 100, like well over 100, I think. It was a very long list, okay? Sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions, but I'll do another one of these and maybe then I'll get one of your questions if I missed you. Sorry. That being said, bye-bye.